in terms of strategies, when I played to get myself psychologically prepared, I was all about routine. I mean, the thing is, there's nothing earth-shattering about what I did, and perhaps there's newer stuff now that would be better, but it was about routine. And then I always wanted to make sure that, obviously, before I arrived at the arena, I could have time in my head on my own. But when I arrived at the arena, and prior to the start of the game at some point, I always tried to make sure that there was a time where I was mentally isolated, so I wasn't chatting with teammates, I wasn't having conversations, that I was just having a moment of zen. This usually was accompanied by some kind of music. A lot of my peers play really motivational, funky beats that get them moving, whereas I was always a big fan of classical music before I played. And not because I'm this cultured, erudite person, but because I found the quietness of much of the types of classical music that I was listening to, and I did listen to very soft. I found that just a moment where my mind would stop worrying, and I could just focus. In terms of the routine aspect of that, I remember very distinctly when I played in Orlando, I drank tea before games. Partly because I was British, and there was something about being a Brit in America that just made it seem wholly appropriate. But what's interesting was that as I did this, I would bring this polystyrene cup of tea out, and then all of a sudden, a few weeks into the game, fans started sending me cups, ceramic mugs, some that they'd made and some that they'd had printed with my name on it or whatever, and I started using these, and I settled on one in particular, I remember, and then I used that constantly at home. And then the weird part was that we had a particularly stressful game against New York, who were good at the time, and I was out of my routine, and I came out and I practiced, and then I sat down on the sideline after my shooting, and two of my teammates ran up to me and they were like, "Meech, what are you doing?" He said, "You haven't had your tea." And I was like, "Oh, you're right, I hadn't had my tea." But the interesting part about that is not that they recognized that my routine had been broken, was that it shows you how an individual's routine within the context of a team becomes part of the team routine. So they thought, and they told me about this afterwards, that I was screwing with their preparation by not following my routine, which I thought was remarkable. In team sports, getting everybody on the same page is incredibly important. My work right now is in organizational settings that aren't often actually teams. But even there, in companies, some companies have this great phrase where they talk about red thread, right? They talk about the idea that the goal of the organization to produce widgets or to consult or whatever it is directly, it must be tied to every person within the organization by this red thread, so that everybody feels ownership of the goal. And with teams, sports teams, that's exactly it. And it's much more difficult than you would think, because, right, the goal of a team is to win. Easy. But in professional sports, it's not just to win. In professional sports, every individual is worrying about how many goals they score or how many points they score. They're worried about how many saves they make on an individual basis, because they know that even when their team loses, if they do their thing well, they might still have an opportunity to move to a better team or to earn more money the next year. So everybody's goal, you often get, I think, nearly always, when you look at teams that have great talent but are underperforming, that is the difference. If you mapped out all their goals in the scheme of things, instead of it being a bunch of players who all have that red thread tied to one goal, it would be a bunch of people with that red thread spreading out like the branches of a tree, each to a slightly different goal, even if that goal is only slightly misaligned. And when it is, psychologically, then you're a group and you're not a team. And there's a massive difference between being a group and a team. Teams are gestalt. They are greater than the sum of their parts. Groups aren't. I'll be honest that I don't watch a huge amount of sport now, but there are players that I look at that I think they have found themselves in the course of a game or a match, they find themselves they manage to push themselves into that zone and keep themselves there. And you can see the ways that they're doing it. So Rafael Nadal, for example, his resilience, his psychological resilience in the midst of what I think is probably still recovery from injury, is pretty remarkable. But if you watch him compete, he is constantly talking to himself, and not in the kind of self-punishing way that many athletes do. He has very practical, it seems, conversations with himself about what he just did. Constantly doing rehearsal. If he hits a shot and it doesn't go quite right, you'll see him do it again, and you'll see him, the face, he'll nod and be like, yeah, that's why I missed that, because I did something technically wrong. It's not that I'm a bad player, it's not that I'm having a down day. And then also his routine, whilst pretty unattractive, is remarkably consistent. Watch what he does before he serves. Wipes his forehead, grabs the crack of his shorts, goes back to his face, taps, 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 spins, serves, every single time. His routine is remarkably consistent. This is probably just an extension of what I said earlier, but delay of gratification has been important in my life. The idea that the thing that I really want, I knew it would take a long, long time to get, but somehow I was able to tie what I was doing today with that. And that's that red thread idea. So every day I knew that when I did this amount of work, this increased my probability of making my final end goal. I think one of the other ways that mentally I was at an advantage is that I have an analytical approach to almost everything. And so I'm able to look at my performances and really see what the cause of success or failure is, as opposed to just how it felt in the moment. And I'm trying to think what else would be different about my approach. I believe there's a massive difference between what's improbable and what's impossible. And most people don't make that distinction. Improbable simply is impossible because it makes you feel better. It always feels better to think that whatever lofty goal you might have in your head is actually impossible for you. Therefore, when you don't achieve it, of course, it's impossible. Whereas I happen to believe that extraordinary things, that improbable things can be made to happen, but not by force of will and not by telling ourselves that we're going to do it, but by pragmatic daily endeavor. The advice I would give to coaches and athletes in order to kind of maximize the impact their mindset can have, it is not rocket science. It would to be actually think about the impact that your mind is having on your performance. And that seems very obvious. But I mean in a holistic way. Understand as a coach that your athletes come to you after a day of stuff. And the impact that that day of stuff has had on their mind will determine whether this practice is better or worse on its own, unless you address it. For athletes, one of the biggest skills that I think you can learn is this idea of mindfulness, of actually being present, because we get so good at stuff. Once you get to a certain level of expertise, you stop actually being there while you're doing it. It happens in teaching, it happens in almost any environment, but definitely in sport. You get so good at doing this drill, this warm-up, that you no longer focus on it. So it's never quite as good as it should be. So the idea of actually training your brain to be present in that moment as an athlete, to really be listening to the advice that you're being given by a coach, to really be focusing on the skill that you're doing, that's how you improve it incrementally. If you're just going through the motions with your brain disengaged, you can do amazingly complex things that way, but you can't be great.